Hello, welcome to the Inner Core. My name is Paul Rauschenbusch, and I'm the Associate Dean of Religious Life and the Chapel at Princeton University. And I am very honored and pleased to welcome Professor Stanley Katz. You will quickly realize during this show that it's hard to say Stanley Katz is the blank, because Stanley Katz is so many different things, and all of them are extraordinary. He has the most varied career and has been celebrated in so many different situations that we're honored that he's here on the Inner Core today. Stan, welcome. Professor Katz, perhaps you can give us just a quick summary of your career. We don't have the 3 hours this would take. So I'm just curious. You got your PhD from Harvard. You undergraduated at Harvard. Tell me, starting out, what fascinated you when you were an undergraduate at Harvard? Like, what really fired you? The way you see students today getting fired up. What fired you up at that time?
Harvard College was a wonderful experience for me. And I think it was because it was a unique moment in American higher education. It was right after the Second World War.
Right.
And many junior faculty who would have been further along in their careers were either just graduate students or junior faculty, and they were still living in the residential colleges. Harvard had residential colleges of the kind Princeton has only had for the last 20 years. And so for the 3 years that I was in one of the residential colleges, my closest friends on the whole were faculty, or were these
and perhaps faculty who had been involved in the war.
That's right.
So like tangible world experience. Very interesting.
That's right. They were older, but more than anything else, I think it was that they were intellectuals and that they were spending time with undergraduates. And so very frequently, of a Friday evening or Saturday evening, and we'd sit around and drink beer with people of that kind. And it was a remarkable opportunity for somebody like me, because I found that I was intrigued by what they were doing. And in fact, I don't remember talking very much about the war, although they had been in the war. They were mainly pretty young. I don't think I knew anyone who had had extensive experience in the war. But they were fully formed adults and intellectuals, and that was a heady experience for a kid from Chicago. And so to me, I think that was really what was great about it.
A lot of your work has been in the law, in cultural policy, in the Supreme Court. Did that start right away? Were you interested in the law when you were at...
No.
No.
No, I really wasn't at all. I mean, as an undergraduate, I majored in a field Harvard still has called history and literature.
Uh-huh.
And I majored in English history and literature, but I was interested in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the reason I was that I was interested in how the modern world came into being, and it came into being, I think, in the late 16th century in some sense, and it was, this confluence of religion and business and science and all of these things that changed dramatically at about that period of time. And so the courses I took, actually I took some English history, obviously. I took no American history, which would be the field I did a PhD in. But I took a lot of courses in philosophy, literature. I was particularly interested in metaphysical poetry, political philosophy. I wrote my thesis on a radical political philosopher of the 17th century, of the Civil War period. So that's essentially what I was interested in.
And so fast forward to today, which later on this month, we are having a whole symposium on you.
That's right.
Isn't that astounding?
Well,
the Woodrow Wilson School is doing an entire weekend on the work of Stan Katz and his contribution to the intellectual life of this country. So congratulations. Are there any particular panels that you're excited to see, or maybe you're just there to soak it on all in?
I'm certainly there to soak it on, and if I expressed a preference, I would be in trouble.
Oh yes, well that's true. That's a good point. That's a good point.
Do that.
But how did you get involved in your work in cultural policy? Because that, I think, is really, like, I think what you described in your undergraduate and then later in history, I think what you're involved in is also looking at the history of culture and the law. And I want to ask you something that we talked a little bit about when we look at the way culture and sometimes religion are intersecting these days. Particularly, if you think of the highest flashpoints, some of the Danish cartoons, some of the theaters that have been shut down because their play is objectionable to the Sikh community. This happened in London. Right. I'm wondering how do you see this? It sounded like you were describing some of the Enlightenment period, or maybe it wasn't. I mean,
it's
earlier than that. Yeah. But how does that inform what we're wrestling with today, which is our very religion, culture, and the law coming into direct conflict with one another?
Of course, I mean, I never thought of it, frankly, in those terms, but those were issues in the period I studied, particularly in the 17th century, because that was the era of the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, and, for instance, the theater was a central site for political conflict during the period, and poetry itself was, I think, a site of cultural conflict. Now, I wouldn't have described it that way in the 1950s when I was doing this. It's a long time ago. No, but actually, I think my interest in cultural policy per se doesn't come from that experience. It comes from my experience as the president of ACLS, the American Council of Learned Societies, which was a job I had from 1986 to 1997. And ACLS is the national organization in the humanities.
Yeah.
But those years, if you recall, were the years of the culture wars.
That's right.
And ACLS, as the humanities organization, was front and center in the culture wars. And I, as the president of ACLS, was one of the spokespersons for people who believed in the integrity of culture and who were accused of undermining cultural values, religious values, political values. And so, having had the responsibility of trying to articulate what it was we were doing and why it was appropriate and democratic and scholarly, things that weren't obvious to some people at that time, focused me resolutely on questions of cultural policy. I had to think about them. So ever since then I have. And when I came back to Princeton, then we formed a center to study those problems.
And how do you see that? I mean, those may have been the days of the culture wars, but some would say that those wars never ended, and we're still in them. In some places, even in a sense, more extreme than originally, in the sense that the stakes seem very high.
Actually, I don't really think that. I mean, I think that the culture wars were a media war, and the media war is over. That's really what the cultural wars were about. But the history of America is a history of culture wars. So I would say we're back now to the ordinary, the ongoing culture war, and that's never going to end. And the terms of expression change, the parties to the conflict change, the sites change, but the controversy goes on.
And how do you balance this idea of respect for the other, respect for others' beliefs, and freedom of expression that are sometimes in tension with critiquing those same beliefs? Is there a place where you stand, or is there a place where you feel like culture as a whole can contain that discussion?
Well, of course, all parties to disputes of this kind believe that they are right and believe that they are listening carefully to the other side, and I do. I think I don't have a carefully defined position, which makes me different than some parties to the dispute, and whether it's political or cultural or religious. On the other hand, what most of us rely upon, I think, is essentially the First Amendment tradition. That is what's almost everybody is committed to the view that what counts is allowing everyone to have a full and uninterrupted say. The pressure points come when the issues are so close to the bone that a variety of people don't feel that they have the luxury to do that their interests, their commitments are threatened, and that sort of open discussion is really no longer appropriate. And those are the moments of crisis in the society. Now, I don't think we're at anything like that point in this country right now.
And you think that's because of our Constitution and that protects it? I mean, do you think
Well,
that...
I think to a very considerable extent it is. I mean, I think we genuinely have a free speech tradition. This, by the way, is one of my oldest scholarly interests. My first book was on the trial of John Peter Zenger, which was the first famous case in America, 1735, relating to freedom of speech. That was newspaper speech in that case. So that's been an interest of mine for a very long time. And so I would say the tradition goes back to the 18th century. It's not even to the Constitution. And it's really essentially an English tradition which we have carried on and broadened, so that it's now broader in the U.S. than it is in the U.K. For me, that's the context for all of this. And I think, on the whole, our record is pretty good, with egregious exceptions. You know, there was McCarthy, there was the Red Scare after World War I. There is vilification of people of various kinds even now. I noticed a news report yesterday about a man in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Someone has just gotten a PhD in anthropology, or I guess archaeology probably, and he has a theory about early life, and perfectly appropriate as far as one can tell. I forget what form, pre-human form he studied, but turns out he is an advocate of biblical literalism. Now, I take it the dissertation can be read without knowing that, and the science is fine. Now the dispute is, should that be an appropriate scholarly production, knowing that this man is a biblical literalist? It's a wonderful example, it seems to me, of where we go wrong. If I understand it correctly, science is science, and insofar as he's applied scientific methodology, he needs to be defended. If he interprets it in a biblical way, then it's a different kind of problem, and I think
it can be challenged on normal...
open to challenge.
Right.
But those are the kinds of... And, there aren't very many countries in which, for instance, that sort of religious challenge, say, to science, it happens more frequently in this country, so that's part of our tradition, too.
What would you say are just maybe 2 or 3 highlights of your career? Obviously, for decades to come, you will be contributing to the world of the academy. But I'm wondering if there are any highlights that you would like to lift up when you think about your career, like a moment where you were particularly proud, or a moment where you were particularly challenged by something and realized, oh, that makes me think in a whole different way. Because I think those moments don't happen every day. But I think in a career such as yours, I think we can lift those up and be thankful for them. So can you think of anything either at Princeton or anywhere else?
Well, I don't know that I've ever had what I would call an intellectual moment. I think that I'm the kind of person who learns gradually and slowly. And my ideas, I would say, have evolved more than changed in a revolutionary fashion. No, I mean, I think for me the great moments are more events and opportunities. And one was the opportunity to be president of ACLS, because it was a chance to move. I've always been the kind of person who cared deeply about what happened at the national and international level, but most of us never get the chance to do anything about that.
That's right.
And so all of a sudden I moved from being a professor here, which previously had been my greatest opportunity, to leading this very large not-for-profit organization that had both national and international responsibilities. And I think that was a heady feeling, and I will always be very grateful to have the chance to do that. And by the way, it was partly, some of it not pleasant. The culture wars I found very unpleasant, although it may have been the most important kinds of thing I did. My greatest accomplishment there, I think, was supervising the commissioning and writing of what's called the American National Biography, which is now 28 volumes long, 18,000 biographies. It's both in print and online, and it is the National Biographical Dictionary. Now, of them, all Americans. But you can't yet be in it yet, because when people write to us and ask how they get in the book, we send back a postcard saying "drop dead."
Very nice. Okay, I'll work on that.
No, but so I mean, it's things like that that are great opportunities. Maybe, and I'll give you another example. I had an opportunity in the late '80s and early '90s working with a small foundation in New York to begin cultural activity in Vietnam before normalization of relations between the U.S. And Vietnam. And we worked there for about 3 years, 4 years, and I think it made a marginal but real contribution to the possibility of normalization of relations there. Again, that's the kind of thing that most of us dream about being able to do. I mean, it's never going to get recorded in the history books, but it might be worth a footnote somewhere. I am, by the way, at the moment trying to do the same thing in Cuba with absolutely no success. But, you know, I think for anybody who wants to think a little bit out of the box, what counts is the chance to try something. And I guess that's what I'm most grateful for in my career, is that I've had more than the normal chances to do something different.
Right, right. That's a great place to stop for a moment. We're going to take a brief break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of Professor Katz's work on a class that happened last year called The Just University. So we're going to take a moment's break and be right back with more with Stan Katz on the Inner Core. Welcome back to the Inner Core. My name is Paul Rauschenbusch, and I'm the Associate Dean of Religious Life in the Chapel at Princeton University. Again, welcome back to Professor Stan Katz, and welcome to Drew Frederick,
yes.
Drew Frederick, who is a class of 07, graduating, but who was very instrumental in a class that I want to talk about today, which was called The Just University. Now, how did this class come to being? Because this isn't something you taught before. This is a new class.
No.
So how did it come to being? The Just University. I find this fascinating. Which was it you who started, or you, or
It's a student-initiated seminar, which is
Wow.
a special course that Princeton University has for students who are interested in a certain topic and are able to find a professor who's willing to teach and able to teach that topic. And so it really, not the course, but the idea for the course was an evolution 3 or 4 years ago, really, when I was involved in something called the Civic Values Task Force,
Right.
which was started by Princeton Project 55, and a group of alumni decided to launch an initiative called the Civic Values Initiative, and they formed 7 undergraduates, and we went around to peer institutions of Princeton
Right.
and wrote a report.
I remember this. That's
And so after the report, we had really hoped to integrate civic engagement in some way, in some capacity, into the curriculum.
Yep.
And so
did you approach Professor Katz and say, we have this idea, we really would like to promote at least the discussion
Right.
and the academic study of what it looks like. So what is a Just University? Let me put it out there. Either one of you can start. What's a Just University? And is Princeton one?
well,
Let me say just one word about it.
Yes.
I got interested in that particular question because one of our former PhD students, who now is at Texas A&M, asked me to give a lecture on that subject
Wow.
in honor of some anniversary of the university. So I wrote a lecture on this subject, but it was a generic lecture, not about any particular university. And I think probably I passed that along
He
to
did.
Drew and some of his colleagues.
And that's how you kind of thought, that's the course.
that was one of the sparks. And I sent an email to Professor Katz that was 3 or 4 pages long, somewhat incoherent, I believe, and he responded back in capital letters, "Wow," which is unusual for Stan to respond that way. He's like, "Let me think about it."
Wow can be both good and bad.
Right.
I think wow can be like, let me buy some time. So tell me, what were some of the things that came up in the class? I mean, what are the criteria by which we can judge if a university is just?
I should say, by the way, that we worked out a syllabus together. Drew and I spent a summer, parts of it last summer, thinking about this, and so the syllabus we had both was intended to give students background reading on what is justice, more generally, but then we did some on the structure of universities so that students would have a broader notion of all of that, particularly in view of the history. And then we picked out a series of special topics. What topics?
We really wanted the students to have the input, and because there's so many issues you could look at when you talk about what is a just university. And so we wanted the students to really be the drivers behind that. And so what we ended up doing is the last 4 weeks of class, after we had grounded it in the history of the modern university, understood the structure of it, we had the students select topics that they were really interested in. And so things like affirmative action, things such as how should a university treat its workers, how should a university treat its surrounding community, state, the nation. And so it really depended upon what students wanted to discuss.
How many students were in the class?
There were 11.
There were 11 students.
And so they each had to present.
Each one wrote a term paper on one problem. For instance, we had two women who were athletic team captains. And each of them wrote a paper relating to athletics and justice in the university. So it was a really wide range of topics.
So what did you learn?
Oh, a tremendous amount. Because
say what you worked on.
I worked on specifically, I looked at, and this is also a reason why it's difficult to say what is a just university, because we didn't just look at Princeton, we didn't just look at Ivy League schools or elite private institutions, we looked at public universities as well. And so my individual paper and my presentation was more on public universities and how they should respond to undocumented immigrants, and whether, specifically, whether they should offer them in-state tuition.
Wow.
And which is
this was something that was, are universities in New Jersey wrestling with this question?
Oh, they are. And at the moment there's a bill that I think over the past couple of years has been presented to the legislator, but no action has been taken on it. So at the moment it really varies between institution, between community colleges.
And the justice question here is it fair to force a resident who is an undocumented person to pay at a higher rate than a resident who is a citizen or a legal resident of the state of New Jersey or any other state? And those were the kinds of questions we focused on.
It really gets, I mean, it seems like the moment you begin to look at this question, you just start peeling the onion.
That's right.
But peeling the onion, is there a core? Like how does a university, or how does any, well, let's stick with the university, how do you get to the core and decide, yes, this is actually, the intention of this is justice? I mean, do you think universities at their core have an intention of being just places, or are they more interested in the accumulation and production of knowledge?
Well, of course, we talked
answer in one. I want an answer.
Yes.
Yes. Nice.
So, one distinction I made in the paper that we talked about in the class is between procedural justice and substantive justice in the university. So procedural justice is sort of easier to deal with. We expect universities to be fair to their students, to their employees, to their faculty, and pretty clear what some of those problems are. For instance, are blue-collar workers at the university getting paid a decent wage? Are they compensated fairly? That's a justice question. But that's a procedural question. But then there are bigger questions, such as, what the university research focus is and how that relates. Should a university be devoting its research energies toward solving the problems of the world, or more focused on whatever it is scholars think are the problems of most interest to them?
And so connection to, for instance, the University of Wisconsin with doing work on military technology, which was the cause of much uproar in the 60s.
And that was true at Princeton too. There was a military math facility here, just like the one in Madison, Wisconsin. And I should mention to the viewers that we were both resident at one point in Madison, Wisconsin.
Indeed, indeed. The rumor has it that there were poker games that my dad lost a lot of money to Professor Katz, but we won't talk about that now. I have a final question for you. Do you feel that Princeton University is on the right trajectory in answering the question of just university?
I would say absolutely. And I would say even I can notice it over the past 4 years, I feel, and there's a different tenor. And I think a lot of it starts really from the presidential leadership of Shirley Tillman, even upper administrators like Vice President Dickerson, who really feel that Princeton is doing well in terms of how it treats people internally and even externally. But I think it also realizes it can do a better job. And it has that in its strategic vision moving forward. And so I do feel that it has improved tremendously. And I can think of an example very concretely of the Pace Center, which when I first got there was a very different center from what it is now. It has grown enormously and really provides a way for students who have creative, innovative ideas about how they can create social change, and the Pace Center works with them and tries to implement those ideas. So
what about from the faculty side? I mean, do you feel like do faculty feel any responsibility to make sure to look at their research and say this is applicable in a positive world bettering sort of way, or is that merely sort of nonsense to think about?
I think lots of faculty feel that way, but I mean it's true here, it's true anywhere. I think that there isn't a faculty point of view. It's a faculty is diverse and reasonably large, and it probably differs somewhat according to field and so forth. But I think there are a substantial proportion of faculty who really do have a commitment, defined in different ways. For many people, doing justly is reflected in the way you teach, whatever the subject is. For others, it's a combination of that, but also your research, because the product of your research, mine is on human rights. I think it's a pretty close fit. But it's also a topic that I have an academic and intellectual interest in, and I wouldn't be the last to deny that. So I think what every university is looking for is some sort of mix of those two things.
It seems to me that Princeton University had a reputation nationally for a country club environment, whether that was ever legitimate, which I don't think I don't think so. But it seems to me very clear now, both the faculty and the students and the entire staff is so dedicated to creating an environment where people can really focus on questions that are applicable and crucial for our day-to-day and for the world's continued cooperation and existence. So the class sounds wonderful. Perhaps it will be offered again. Special commendation to you, Drew, for really making it happen. And that's the kind of great students that we have at Princeton, and we'll continue to draw from. And so congratulations and well done. We are out of time. It has been a real pleasure to have both Professor Katz and Drew Frederick here with me. Until the next time, take care. Again, my name is Paul Rauschenbusch, and this is all for now from the Inner Core.